The following audio is included in the Worldwide Church of God Library Collection. Please visit wwcg-library.com and explore the incredible truths that answer the mysteries of life.
Gossip and Accusation Must Stop. Written by Mr. Herbert W Armstrong, as published in the July 31st, 1978 issue of the Good News magazine. Perhaps the number one problem, yes, and even the number one and most prevalent sin in God's church today is careless gossip and rumor spreading. Whether or not realized, it often becomes accusation and slander. If a hostile student demonstration, such as organized and promoted by communists, had appeared on the Ambassador campus, I would have made it my business to identify the leader and get rid of him. Once such actions lose their leadership, they disintegrate. It's the same on our problem of rumors, especially those ugly rumors that discredit or accuse, actually, perhaps unrealized, a form of character assassination. I fully realize that often this is mere carelessness, a sort of thinking through the mouth with no deliberate intention to harm, but it does harm, and sometimes it is intended to harm. The subject came up in a conversation with David Antion. At my request, he has prepared the following memorandum on God's law covering this subject. This sort of thing must be stamped out of God's church. Our leader and head of the church, Jesus Christ, is turning God's church around, though he uses his human servant in doing so. However, because 1. We have perhaps carelessly neglected emphatic teaching on this subject, and 2. Much of such gossip or rumor has probably been done carelessly without full realization of the seriousness of it, I have decided to hold off direct and definitive punitive correction action until this thing has been emphasized by the ministry and in print before the membership. I realize that even many of us, including myself, may have been guilty of this through carelessness, thoughtlessness, or neglect. I have decided, therefore, that first we must put emphatic emphasis on this matter in teachings, sermons, and articles. But this is to be followed by direct action, seeking out the source, the one who started the rumor, false accusation, or whatever, and then making an example of that person, if necessary, before the whole church. I feel that this is Christ's way of stamping out this evil from God's church, and I act, therefore, in his name. Following is Mr. Antion's memo to me on this subject. Here is a memo you asked me to write when I was in your office last Friday. It is on the subject of what God's law has to say about false witnesses and accusation. As you have taught for many years, the statutes of Scripture are derived from the great laws of God in the 10 Commandments. The 9th Commandment. The 9th Commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, is a basis for the other statutes and judgments in this category in the Bible. Most people assume that the 9th Commandment is only against lying. Though it does cover lying, Revelation 21 verse 8, Colossians 3 verse 9, it is mainly against false accusations made against another. You have also taught that the main object of the last 6 commandments is love of your neighbor, Romans 13 verse 9 through 10. And the 9th commandment forbids making a false witness against your neighbor, thus harming him. The Moffat and New English Bible say, you shall not give false evidence against your neighbor. Not a light thing. Does God consider it a light thing for a man to falsely accuse his neighbor or brother? And what about Jesus' words, judge not that ye be not judged? We know that we can judge a person's actions as either being in conformity or not with God's law. But can we judge his heart? But why doest thou judge thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Romans 14 verse 10. And in verse 13, let us not therefore judge another anymore. The Apostle James must have had trouble with judging and accusing in his day, for he writes, speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother, and judges his brother, speaketh evil of the law, and judges the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver, who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest one another? James 4 verse 11 through 12. Those who would speak evil of another and judge their brothers are in reality judging the law and speaking evil of God's law. And like you have said, the one who accuses us usually is guilty of the very thing he accuses others of. False accusations divisive. If a minister got up in the pulpit and spoke evil of the law of God, which is holy, just, and good, he would be dismissed from the ministry. But what happens to him if he judges the intent, thought, and beliefs of his brother? For too long, God's work and God's ministry have been divided because of false accusations and judging. It is time that God's law be applied and that God's own judgments be enforced against those who judge and falsely accuse. It was false accusers that got Jesus crucified. Should God's church house them now? Should it allow false accusers, thus encouraging them in their deeds, to continue their satanic actions? What is the motive? Many people don't mean or intend to be malicious with their words. They are just careless and neglectful. They say and pass on information without checking it out, without responsibility. For some, it is just a habit. But God's law also deals with neglect, and one can forfeit his life through neglect. See Exodus 21, verse 28 through 36. Sometimes people accuse because they want to get another person in trouble and see him thrown out of his job or the church. Whatever the motive, whether neglect, carelessness, or malice, Jesus' words still ring true. But I say unto you that every idle, Moffat says careless, word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof in the day of judgment. For by thy words thou shalt be condemned. Matthew 12, verse 36 through 37. Another translation says it this way. I tell you this, there is not a thoughtless word that comes from men's lips, but they will have to account for it on the day of judgment. New English Bible. God's judgment. But what should happen to people who falsely accuse? Here is God's judgment. If a malicious witness appeals against a man to accuse him of evildoing, then the two parties in the dispute shall appeal before the Eternal, that is, before the priest and the presiding judges. The judges shall investigate the matter carefully, and if it turns out that the witness is malicious and that he has given false witness against his fellow, you must treat him as he meant his fellow to be treated. So shall you eradicate evil from your midst. The other shall hear and fear, and never again be guilty of such a sin. Deuteronomy 19, verse 16 through 20, Moffat translation. But what should happen to the person who makes these accusations? In the last few years, God's church has been a house divided and filled with this deadly evil. Accusers take verbal rifle shots at each other, trying to get them fired or excommunicated or to damage their reputations. But the only thing that happens to the accuser is that he is told he is mistaken, or if confronted by his intended victim, he apologizes. He, the accuser, risks absolutely nothing. He damages others, almost succeeds in getting them fired, demoted, thrown out of the church, or cast in suspicion, considered untrustworthy, and avoided. At the very least, he causes them to consume enormous amounts of time, trying to straighten out the problem and track down the rumor. But nothing happens to the accuser. He is fine, alive and well, and ready for another try in the future. Slander affects relationships. One of the worst things about all of this is that often the victim of the accusation doesn't even know that he is being slandered, accused, cast in suspicion, judged. Things are said that may stick in the minds of those who hear. Though no action is taken, these slanders affect the relationship that people have with the accused person. People avoid him, mistrust him. He is passed over for important jobs or assignments. All this just because of a word or two said carelessly, neglectfully, or maliciously. Only by applying God's law, His government, to the church can we rid the church of this evil and have the happiness, peace, unity, and joy that God will approve and bless in His church.
Thank you for listening to this audio file from the Worldwide Church of God Library Collection. Please visit wwcg-library.com and explore the incredible truths that answer the mysteries of life.